Hello and welcome to the Green Bylaws Toolkit 101 webinar. My name is DG Blair and I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar. The Stewardship Centre's mandate is to strengthen ecological stewardship in BC by providing educational, technical, and capacity programs and resources to organizations, governments, the private sector, and the general public. And we always do this through collaborative partnerships. As such, we are really pleased to be able to host the Green Bylaws Toolkit on our website. You'll find the 2021 version of the Green Bylaws Toolkit at stewardshipcenterbc.ca/green bylaws. It's available there for free download. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Deborah Curran, who is an associate professor of the Faculty of Law and School of Environmental Studies, as well as executive director of the Environmental Law Center at the University of Victoria. She teaches in the areas of land and water, including water law, municipal law, and the Environmental Law Clinic. Deborah's work focuses on governance, how we make decisions about the environment and who has authority or thinks they do to make those decisions. Her work specifically explores how colonial law interacts with or has an impact on Indigenous laws and communities. Ione Smith is an professional agrologist with a background in agricultural planning and land resource science. She founded Upland Agricultural Consulting in 2010, specializing in innovative agriculture and food security plans, climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies, and farm business plans. She has worked with Indigenous communities, governments of all levels, and non-governmental organizations. In addition to her consulting work, Ione serves as vice chair of the Agricultural Land Commission and is an instructor at Simon Fraser University, where she teaches community economic development approaches to food. Finally, we have Alexia Cadoret. She is the founder and principal of Cadoret Law, a boutique law firm based in Vancouver. Striving with innovation, effectiveness, and tenacity, Alexia brings a unique international background in a wide range of legal areas. She specializes in environmental law, finding legal solutions for clients who advocate for the protection of the environment and fight climate change. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Deborah.
Welcome to this third edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit. This webinar is intended to provide an overview of the new material that's in the toolkit and to explore some evolving thinking in the way in which we're approaching green bylaws. I'm so delighted to be joined by Ione Smith and Alexia Cadoret to deliver this webinar for you. In terms of the outline, this webinar is first going to provide a context within which local governments can support the natural environment and an overview of the toolkit, this third edition. I'm going to discuss a little bit the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the provincial government's commitment to its implementation and what that down the line might mean for local governments and their use of the Green Bylaws Toolkit. And then the remainder of the webinar will focus on green bylaws under the themes of connectivity, systems, and scale. So for each of these themes, we'll provide a description of how local government thinking is evolving in this area and some case studies of these particular themes in action. Our focus in the third edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit is on green infrastructure and connecting the natural environment. So green infrastructure are the natural and semi-natural areas that have both environmental and engineered features. It's the sum total of ecosystem elements that maintain biodiversity and functioning ecosystems, and it really is the foundation of our communities. So local governments' plan and management of these areas is to enhance nature's ability to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services, such as clean air and water, functioning hydrology, and also to support biodiversity in both urban and rural settings. These can be planned strategically and create a green infrastructure network. So green infrastructure and biodiversity are best protected and enhanced when considered together. Areas of biodiversity can be connected through the green infrastructure. This slide of or table of local government jurisdiction is a long-standing item within the Green Bylaws Toolkit, and it really shows the entire jurisdiction handed down from the province to local governments around green bylaws. So this is all of the environmental protection jurisdiction for local governments. And as you can see, it's fairly extensive in some ways. Some of the most important authority for environmental protection relates to land use, with tools and levers such as regional growth strategies, official community plans, zoning bylaws, and the ability to establish development permit areas. However, other powers, such as for regulatory bylaws or tree and watercourse protection or soil deposit and removal, can also play an important role. So it's important to note that while local governments have significant authority for green infrastructure and protection of the natural environment, there's still a lot of room for improvement. No local government uses the full extent of their powers for protecting and restoring the natural environment. So the overarching goal is to take a nested approach to green bylaws, focus on green bylaws throughout the whole policy and regulatory structure. This is just a quick overview of the chapters. So they will look pretty much the same to you if you're familiar with the Green Bylaws Toolkit, but just to show that they really do take a deep dive approach into all of the various planning and bylaw opportunities under the Local Government Act and the Community Charter. So in particular, at the end of it, so chapters 17 to 27 give you sample bylaw provisions for your use. In terms of local government jurisdiction, for almost 25 years, I've been working on green bylaws. And in all of that time, working with communities across the province, whether it be local governments themselves, with Indigenous communities or with community organizations, I really have 5 primary observations about the structure of local governments in implementing green bylaws. So the first is that local governments need to take a nested approach to environmental health, from a regional plan focused on connectivity to local government specific commitments and then regulation for individual properties. Secondly, in terms of planning, there has to be planning, bylaw, and community support. So people won't subject themselves to regulations unless it is part of a larger strategy or planning vision. And this then creates a culture of conservation. Thirdly, when we focus on healthy communities, so ecosystems, biodiversity, and humans, rather than allowing the conversation center around individual property rights in land, then we get a much more effective and proactive forward-looking approach to green bylaws. It's about water management, compact, efficient development, as well as protection of property and biodiversity. The fourth is that by creating measurable ecosystem performance-based objectives or targets, such as 95% of new development will occur within the urban growth boundary, or we're going to restore 5 kilometers of riparian habitat. This creates a very specific and measurable direction for local government outcomes. And finally, we've seen very general guidelines in official community plans or DPAs, development permit areas, that have achieved good results. But we've also seen very detailed guidelines or policies that have had poor outcomes. So we don't need better information to make good decisions. We need to act now. Just before I hand it over to my colleagues to talk about some case studies and our other themes, I just wanted to touch on the increasing recognition of Indigenous rights, in particular over local government or in conversation with local government authority for land use and servicing. So both the federal and provincial governments have committed to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And a lot of that relates to or is concerned with Indigenous peoples having control over and say in what occurs under their own legal orders, their own jurisdiction, what happens in their territory. While BC courts have found that local governments don't have a duty to consult specifically with First Nations on their decisions, So that's under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Like the province and the feds do have a duty to consult. However, because we have the new Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that the province has enacted, that is committing to aligning BC laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it also gives the provincial government the ability to delegate authority for decision-making and enter into collaborative management agreements with Indigenous governing organizations. So because most local government's jurisdiction affects land and territory, including servicing decisions, there will be implications for local governments down the line. So local governments can begin or carry on. I know there's a lot of good relationships between local governments and Indigenous communities, but continue to make this shift by developing relationships with Indigenous communities on whose territories local governments are operating, and developing joint planning and decision-making processes.
So connectivity refers to maintaining the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes and sustained life on Earth. This includes protecting habitat corridors that knit together fragmented landscapes and creating the links required to conserve biodiversity, foster ecological integrity, and support the recovery of species at risk. Human activity reduces connectivity, which in turn makes it harder for plant and animal species to move between natural areas and impairs the ability of those areas to provide ecosystem services. So local governments can develop connectivity strategies as part of their environmental health infrastructure to decrease fragmentation and reconnect ecosystems throughout their jurisdiction. The aim is to provide local and senior governments and other stakeholders with priorities as well as regulatory and planning tools that can help them make sure that local habitats persist as viable elements of healthy regional watersheds and ecosystems. Connectivity strategies and regulatory bylaws can apply across both public and private landscapes to ensure that new development does not interfere with the underlying connectivity priority. Whenever possible, a broader regional view encourages thinking beyond municipal boundaries and presents opportunities for collaboration among municipalities on conservation efforts, often with cost-saving benefits. For example, a strategy can consider the whole extent of a riparian corridor that crosses municipal boundaries.
So we have a few examples, case studies to provide you with. The first is the Okanagan Wildlife Corridor. In 2015, researchers from UBC Okanagan, the Regional District of the Central Okanagan, and the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program conducted digital mapping to determine the most likely areas of wildlife movement corridors in the region. This was reviewed by an advisory committee which included the Okanagan Nation Alliance and West Bank First Nation, and which identified 65 kilometers of 1 kilometer wide corridors between Okanagan Mountain Provincial Park and Kalamalka Lake Provincial Park to be prioritized for protection. The corridor runs along higher elevation land that is mostly rangeland. As the district is underdeveloped, it chose to protect this corridor now in order to maintain connectivity in the region in the future. The District of Lake Country designated 16 kilometers of wildlife corridor under its Environmental Development Permit area in its 2018 official community plan. The Environmental Development Permit Area guidelines describe the benefits of the ecological connectivity corridor as providing habitat for many species and allowing species to move between the parks to find food and ensure genetic diversity and the overall survival of the species. The Environmental Development Permit Area also covers a number of smaller ecological local corridors identified that, if conserved and/or restored, will contribute to maintaining ecosystem connectivity. The Environmental Development Permit Area guidelines included detailed information applicable to the corridor, including keeping it free of structures, installing appropriate screening at wildlife crossing areas, keeping a minimum width of the corridor, habitat offsetting, avoiding fencing, and ensuring fencing that it is used is not hazardous to wildlife. The City of Kelowna is following Lake Country's lead as it released its draft 2040 official community plan in January 2021, which included an Okanagan Mountain to Kalamalka Lake Provincial Park ecosystem connectivity corridor, as well as a secondary Knox Mountain Ridge ecosystem connectivity corridor, both of which are proposed to be designated under the City of Kelowna's Environmental Development Permit Area. The updated Kelowna official community plan includes a policy to discourage development or land uses that will have a negative impact on properties that intersect with the corridors. The official community plan recently received second and third reading and is now headed to the province for approval. The larger ecosystem connectivity in the Okanagan project connects with two cross-border corridor projects, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative and the Sagelands Heritage Program by Conservation Northwest. The second example is in Cumberland. The village of Cumberland is a good example of a small rural community providing a basis for connectivity within its bylaws. Cumberland's official community plan defines a connectivity area as the area between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that can be developed for sustainable human use in a manner that demonstrates stewardship through the protection, remediation, and enhancement of connectivity for habit and wildlife in the area, as well as surrounding sensitive environmental areas, and overlays and implements through best practice planning, design, and management, the integration of passive or active outdoor recreation, forestry, and agriculture. In 2014, Cumberland designated an environmental protection development permit area over its entire land base to further help establish this connectivity. In order to classify sensitive ecosystem areas within the development permit area, the village used the 2004 Sensitive Ecosystems Inventory produced by the provincial and federal governments and areas identified by the Comox Valley Project Watershed Society in 2013. The development permit area is designed so that connectivity is restored and maintained and includes a diagram of the components of a natural areas network. The next example is from the City of Surrey. The City of Surrey is an example of a large urban center that has ensured that the tools being used to maintain connectivity continue to evolve over time. 10 years ago, in 2011, the city completed an ecosystem management study. The study was a citywide ecosystem mapping exercise used to identify a green infrastructure network for the city. This is an interconnected network of open space, including parks, streams, and other natural areas identified as hubs, sites, and connecting corridors. It incorporates a wide variety of land cover types, including backyards, boulevards, urban forests, wetlands, rivers, and shorelines in order to maintain connectivity among habitat areas. The Green Infrastructure Network is based on three core principles. First, preserving large core habitat areas. Second, ensuring connectivity between habitat areas. And third, providing a diversity of habitat features. Approximately 2,700 hectares of the Green Infrastructure Network have been secured through various land use dedication mechanisms, with approximately 1,200 hectares of that land being private land. The city intends for some portion of that private land to be acquired so it can be protected to achieve intended benefits. In 2014, the City of Surrey endorsed a biodiversity conservation strategy, a policy framework to establish biodiversity goals and targets and conservation priorities for the city, and is intended to work in conjunction with the city's official community plan. Because so much habitat is located on private land, where the city has limited direct control, the cooperation and engagement of a broad spectrum of stakeholders was essential in keeping the biodiversity conservation strategy. Key features of the strategy include identifying and quantifying current biodiversity and habitat resources in the city and setting conservation targets and priorities, designating 14 biodiversity management areas based on the unique conditions that influence biodiversity, providing options that developers and homeowners can choose from to enhance biodiversity, offering a series of policy recommendations to support the initiatives of the strategy, and finally, providing a roadmap for long-term monitoring program to measure the success of the strategy. The Biodiversity Conservation Strategy and Green Infrastructure Network are recognized and interwoven into many of the city's key strategic documents. These include the Parks, Recreation and Culture Strategic Plan, the Integrated Stormwater Management Plans, the Shade Tree Management Plan, the Coastal Flood Adaptation Strategy, the Climate Adaptation Strategy, Newton's Sustainability and Action Plan, and the city's overarching sustainability charter. The strategy and green infrastructure network are further operationalized at the environmental development permit area level, both in terms of mapping and guidelines. To help further existing efforts to meet the intended objectives of the biodiversity conservation strategy, the city hired a biodiversity conservation planner in 2019, whose role is to oversee implementation of the strategy at both planning and operational levels. Beginning in 2021, the city is increasing the citywide parkland acquisition development cost charge rate with the goal of providing funding to acquire green infrastructure network lands identified in the biodiversity conservation strategy.
Connectivity is the foundation of ecological health, biodiversity, and functioning ecosystems. Green bylaws approaches that support connectivity include regional and local plans and strategies, such as biodiversity strategies or green infrastructure networks that identify connectivity as a baseline. In turn, OCPs designate connectivity networks or connectivity in general in both policies and environmental development permit areas. Local governments can amend their zoning bylaws to ensure that density and setbacks direct development away from these networks. In addition, regulatory bylaws can support the ecological function of these networks by ensuring that land use activities and fragmentation do not impair biodiversity. These bylaws include watercourse protection bylaws, soil removal and deposit bylaws, and subdivision bylaws. There is a consensus among environmental protection staff in BC that local governments should first try to incorporate new regulations into existing bylaws and permitting processes before creating new administrative requirements. Adding new values or standards to existing processes will result in easier staff uptake and less confusion on the part of development applicants. Unfortunately, environmental regulation treats ecological systems as separate pieces: trees, water quality, water flows, flooding, and soil. The way the Local Government Act and Community Charter enable green bylaws reflect that siloed approach. Many local governments know that addressing one problem, for example, channeling stormwater into pipes for rapid removal, will lead to other problems such as erosion of fish-bearing watercourses and downstream flooding. Focusing on systems when exploring green bylaws requires considering the natural environment and its processes as a whole. It takes effort to take a whole systems approach to green bylaws, but that is ultimately what will result in the support and restoration of biodiversity and its underlying ecological system. Just like connectivity, a systems approach requires overarching strategies, such as biodiversity or environmental strategies, to provide direction for implementation through specific bylaws. Green infrastructure and the health of ecological systems require reintegrating policies and approaches to water quality and quantity, rainwater management focused on infiltration, habitat restoration, and air quality. Working landscapes are an important part of ecological systems and include a community's non-urbanized environment. Often held as private or crown lands, they are often a central element of a community's green infrastructure and include agricultural, ranch, and forested landscapes. The new focus on connectivity and systems approach will require restoration in many cases, particularly with local government experiencing climate change impacts most acutely. Restoration will be required in many jurisdictions to restore natural processes. In many communities, we will not be able to engineer our way out of flooding, drought, and other climate change impacts.
One example of taking a systems approach is the Central Okanagan Regional District's Aquatic Ecosystems Development Permit Guidelines. In recognition of the importance of riparian corridors as fish habitat, the provincial government requires local governments in certain areas to protect these corridors and to begin to harmonize tri-jurisdictional regulations, that is federal, provincial, and local, for development within fish-bearing watercourses. Under the Riparian Areas Protection Act, the provincial government enacted the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation, which establishes processes for avoiding harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat by determining setbacks for development from watercourses and mitigating damage to riparian fish habitat. Local governments in BC have responded to the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation in a variety of ways that reflect the ecological diversity of the province. The Regional District of Central Okanagan has chosen to exceed the requirements of the regulation by embedding the regulations process into its own riparian environmental assessment process, provided for in the Regional District's Aquatic Ecosystem Development Permit Guidelines. The Regional District's environmental assessment policy requires that the environmental assessment must meet the standards set out in the terms of reference for professional reports for planning services and the Riparian Area Protection Regulation. The environmental assessment must also consider a variety of best management practices documents, including the Sensitive Ecosystem Inventory, the Environmental Assessment Best Practice Guide for Wildlife at Risk in Canada, Raptor's Best Management Practices document, and Develop with Care, the Environmental Guidelines for Urban and Rural Land Development in British Columbia. The Aquatic Ecosystem Development Permit Guidelines are triggered by applications for rezoning, subdivision, building permits, and official community plan amendments. The development permit application must be submitted to and approved by the Regional District prior to any land disturbance within the Aquatic Ecosystem Development Permit area. The development permit guidelines direct that a qualified environmental professional must evaluate, establish, and monitor a leaf strip that is to remain undisturbed for the protection and restoration of the aquatic ecosystem. Leaf strips should link together to provide a continuous network of ecosystems, and they may allow public access. They direct a minimum 15-meter wide leaf strip or the setback determined under the Riparian Area Protection Regulation, whichever is greater. The Regional District's approach has resulted in sufficiently stringent requirements that discourage development and setbacks within riparian areas that would trigger the regulation process. Regional District staff have found that most developers avoid proposing development within the setback area in order to avoid having to involve a qualified environmental professional and go through the extra administrative steps. In addition to the setbacks, the Aquatic Ecosystem Development Permit Area Guidelines use performance-based criteria. They establish what the end state should be, and it is largely up to the developers or owners using best management practices to determine how to meet the criteria on their particular site in accordance with the required site plans. For example, the guidelines require that property owners maintain hydrologic regimes, normal wetland processes, and entire intact ecosystems. It is important to note that even if local governments are not required by provincial law to follow the Riparian Area Protection Regulation, any local government can model riparian area protection on this approach, particularly by establishing aquatic ecosystem development permit areas. The next example is Kelowna's Mission Creek Restoration Initiative. In 2008, a broad group of stakeholders, including all levels of government, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, Westbank First Nation, and non-government organizations, signed a Memorandum of Understanding to form the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative Working Group. The Mission Creek Restoration Initiative seeks to restore the natural functions to the lower sections of Mission Creek in the city of Kelowna. Its main goals are to restore fish habitat, as it is home to many fish and species at risk, and manage flooding, as it is all in the area of a floodplain. Since the 1950s, Mission Creek has been channelized and diked. The current thinking at that time was that these approaches prevented flooding, but we now know that squeezing watercourses can actually increase the cause and risk of flooding if the dikes fail or flows breach the banks. Advocacy work started in the 1990s, and the province conducted several restoration feasibility studies. These studies recommended that the city and other parties reestablish the floodplain to improve fish and wildlife habitat, create a more natural and meandering creek route, and restore wetlands. Phase 1 of the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative has been completed. It involved planning, public outreach, and a construction project moving back a dike on a section of the creek into land that was already owned by the city to widen the floodplain. There have also been several habitat enhancement projects, primarily run by the Okanagan Nation Alliance and West Bank First Nation. For example, they have placed boulders in the creek channel and studied their effectiveness as fish habitat. As of 2021, there are several feasibility studies ongoing, which are assessing the potential of private properties in the area to be incorporated into the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative. This phase is specifically looking at purchasing land to continue with increasing dike setbacks. The Mission Creek Restoration Initiative is funded primarily through the city, the province, the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, and the Okanagan Basin Water Board. One unique source of funding is the City of Kelowna's Mission Creek Habitat Compensation Bank, which was endorsed by Council in 2007 and allows the city to achieve the federal policy of no net loss of habitat requirement by permitting cash payments into the bank, either when achieving no net loss on a specific property if not feasible, or because it has been determined that habitat compensation elsewhere is more valuable. The third example is found within the city of Maple Ridge. The city of Maple Ridge recognized the benefits that wetlands provide to the city, so as a first step, inventoried its more than 300 wetlands within its boundaries. And then in 2006, it enacted the Maple Ridge Watercourse Protection Bylaw, which regulates water quality and flows and manages stormwater and erosion sediment control related to watercourses. Once a developer submits a development application, the city works with the developer during the application review process to incorporate engineered stormwater management systems into their building proposals, with a focus on maintaining hydrology and attenuating flows. There are approximately 25 to 35 constructed wetlands in Maple Ridge that have been built in the last 15 years as part of large-scale commercial and residential buildings. The city works on a per-project basis, helping the developer design wetlands and ponds into the developable areas of the site, and potentially blending them into environmentally sensitive areas that are to be retained into the final development. The city has conducted integrated stormwater management plans in its largest watersheds and has concluded that the engineered wetlands have helped water quality and flow rates back into the water courses. The city is creating for consideration a green infrastructure management strategy, which will include engineered wetlands. It is also partnering regionally with Metro Vancouver to attempt to assemble wetlands into public trust and conservation areas, as it recognizes the habitat benefit in addition to the stormwater management benefit. An environmental planner at the city suggests that citizens often have concerns related to the ecological benefits of the constructed wetlands. Concerns include aesthetics, safety, mosquitoes, vegetation survival, and maintenance expectations and costs. Staff stress that public education, appropriate design standards, and ongoing monitoring and maintenance can help to deal with these concerns.
Ecological systems are as varied as local governments. So how can a local government implement a systems approach? So for example, in rural area or regional districts, a problem was identified. Indeed, applications for subdivision of large parcels of undeveloped land into 2-hectare lots are increasing exponentially in the regional district of hills and valleys. Residents and several board members are concerned because all development in these rural areas rely on groundwater, and there is an incomplete understanding of watershed characteristics. It also compromises the landscape's ability to support resource activities such as harvesting non-timber forest products and small-scale logging. And finally, it also fragments wildlife corridors, riparian areas, and other important natural areas. So to address the problem, the regional district staff begin by mapping agricultural lands and environmentally sensitive areas to establish a baseline of the extent of the green infrastructure and develop priorities for protecting sensitive ecosystems. Then through an OCP review process for several rural electoral areas, the regional district adopts policies that reinforce the rural large lot nature of the area and encourages site-specific development away from sensitive ecosystems throughout targeted land use designations. The board may also amend the subdivision servicing bylaw to include landscaping and road design requirements to ensure that new roads quickly conform to the area's rural character. So many local governments will already have some green bylaw infrastructure in place and can build from that. It is important to have an overarching biodiversity or environment strategy that identifies specific plan, policy, and bylaw approaches. This type of strategy often includes identifying the green infrastructure and its system components. It can also identify specific problems that must be addressed using natural assets or restoration approaches. From that strategic direction or the identification of specific problems, local government staff can approach solutions as individual projects that ultimately lead to nested and connected web of plans and bylaws pointing to long-term ecological health. The examples of systems approaches here described are the result of over a decade of work. So the key is to start somewhere, address a particular problem while you initiate an overarching strategy.
So our final theme is scale. And just like green infrastructure requires attention to all scales, so do successful green bylaws approaches. So while an OCP policy can be very effective, and I'm thinking of Saanich's urban containment boundary or Whistler's bed unit cap, typically the better nested ecological health is at all layers of local governance, planning, and regulation, the better you will get results. So ideally, a regional scale action such as in regional growth strategies or conservation strategies would support local policies in official community plans, which then directs specific action or development approaches at a neighborhood or property scale, such as through environmental development permit areas or other regulatory bylaws. Likewise, this nested approach provides more opportunities for the public to interact with green bylaws and understand how our common value of a healthy environment operates more broadly. The commitment to ecological health must be distributed through all levels of local governance, so that when individual impacts to specific properties are considered by staff and decision makers, there's a strong basis of support for the bylaw and policy infrastructure of the green bylaws. In particular, if this regulatory scaling doesn't exist, environmental development permit areas are vulnerable to critiques based on public perception of private property rights and what people think they're able to do with their individual properties. So I just wanted to give you one example of the disconnect between impact to specific properties and the regulatory and planning infrastructure that comes before it. And that's the dismantling of the District of Saanich's Upland Environmental Development Permit area that Saanich enacted in 2012. So at that time, the district was unique in its approach as it had conducted extensive and best practices mapping and first responded to the riparian areas, what's now the Riparian Areas Protection Act requirements through an environmental development permit area designation. So it had designated five categories of sensitive ecosystem for protection, which included 10 to 60 meter buffer around what were called sensitive ecosystems based on the 2002 sensitive ecosystem inventory produced by the feds in the province. Red and blue listed animals, plants, and ecological communities and their habitats that was based on information provided by the Conservation Data Center. Wildlife trees based on tracking information provided by Wildlife Tree Stewardship Program, etc. So you can see that their technical or their scientific basis was very strong in terms of they were relying on credible sources of information. So this extensive mapping approach that the district used provided clarity and certainty as to which areas were protected under the environmental development permit area, and it reduced the need for negotiation with developers over whether particular areas did or did not qualify as an environmentally sensitive area. And it's important to note that when the EDPA was moved from the riparian, was the initial approach, to the upland, it included just 2% of properties in Saanich. Around 2015, a group of residents formed Saanich Citizens for a Responsible EDPA Society and lobbied council to either change the EDPA or rescind the EDPA, as they claimed that the designation negatively had an impact on their property values and was inexact in its mapping. So, for example, I was at many meetings where landowners argued that because the EDPA transected their garage, it was flawed. In addition, owners of 72 of the 2,200 properties within that designation applied to council to have their properties removed from the designation. So after a lengthy public consultation process that included several public meetings late into the night with hundreds of people attending, District Council voted 5-4 to rescind the EDPA in November of 2017. Council also voted to instruct staff to prepare a report on developing a policy framework addressing biodiversity, climate change, stewardship, and a new EDPA. So the new process began in 2020. This process, so the rescinding of the EDPA, also resulted in the discipline of a registered professional biologist. So the public pressure resulting in council rescinding Saanich's EDPA demonstrates the importance of really creating a green bylaws infrastructure. A few of the lessons learned include that Saanich had relied on its reputation as a leader in green bylaws, the foundation of which was detailed mapping to expand its EDPA. However, this occurred without any confirmation more broadly as part of a biodiversity strategy or specific focus on environmental protection. There were lots of general OCP policies about environment, but nothing that directed specific action or ongoing communication to citizens. Another lesson was that the detailed mapping actually hindered a productive conversation with landowners about ecological protection, because the citizens would dismiss the mapping as valid or as invalid because a line would go through a garage, or it would be in an area of lawn that the landowner would then say, well, the entire regime of the EDPA is false, or it's not valid because of this faulty mapping, or what they perceive to be faulty mapping. So what we see many local governments doing, and we see this in the example of Cumberland, we see it with Highlands, that local governments are designating their entire landscape, their entire territory as an environmental development permit area protection of the natural environment, so that any development then is screened for impacts on water, impacts on connectivity, impacts on systems. It's part of creating a culture of conservation. This requires more than just bylaws. It requires an ongoing community conversation and public education, pointing out the financial benefits of green infrastructure, what it means to connectivity, means to us as citizens, but also to the functioning of a local government. So in conclusion, scaling green bylaws can create a culture of conservation, which extends much more broadly than any single environmental development permit area or bylaw, and can make such efforts by a vocal minority of property owners less likely to be successful in resulting in the rescinding of conservation policies. A successful approach to green bylaws creates a strong framework of policies and regulation, embedding conservation in regional growth strategies, official community plans, joining OCP policies with environmental development permit areas through, for example, a biodiversity strategy or a green infrastructure strategy. So generally, citizens show stronger support for the creation of an EDPA, for example, and other green bylaws when those are brought in as a result of a larger public conversation, like an official community plan review or a larger biodiversity strategy. We see best practices in green bylaws by staff and local government leadership moving away from protected areas or protecting specific ecosystem elements to a much broader connecting ecological systems and biodiversity, which includes a whole ecosystem approach to green infrastructure and ecosystem health. So we want to thank you for your interest, and I hope that the examples we've highlighted here spark some new ideas and are of interest to you. And please do check out the many more new examples in the 3rd edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit.